So in terms of the rationale for how the government comes in and justifies, let's say, broadly speaking, diluting or bending, pushing, civil liberties, for what rationale? You've mentioned that you've traced a lot of your, core interest in these issues to the war on terror, a period I remember very well after 9/11, of course, the passing of the Patriot Act, and the basic policy of the Bush administration that I understood at the time. The point they kept insisting on was the need to sacrifice some of our freedoms in order to get more safety. And then progressively, as a result, we see the process of giving away more and more freedoms to large bureaucracies, a lot of times also, through contracts with major corporations. Do you think that in many ways this, historically, from an historical perspective, and what we see today, of the Twitter files and so forth that we're going to get to, this is where the sort of template for top-down government control was created for modern democracy? So usually amplifying some kind of legitimate fear, something that exists, but sort of amplifying it, and then promising to provide the population with more safety, usually with the help of large corporations who get large contracts and so forth, all under this idea of protecting us and keeping us safe, and then quietly, kind of like incrementally grabbing more and more power and justifying us giving away more and more of our freedoms. Do you think that's roughly where the template was set and that you see sort of since then replicated in different ways?
I think that's the formula, the recipe for authoritarianism in every part of the world, going back for as long as human history is recorded. Human fear is a very powerful motivating factor. Fear is a very important instinct that we have, right? If we see a lion or something that's threatening to us, we need to feel fear so that we're impelled to run away and to protect ourselves. This instinct is very important. And when you can put someone into fear, you can really control them, especially if you're simultaneously offering to protect them from whatever they're scared of. And governments and tyrants and authoritarians and dictators have always known that if you can put a population into fear about some external threat or some internal threat, that is when they are most easily malleable. That is when they're willing to give up most of their rights, because most people don't value rights when they feel like their physical safety is immediately jeopardized. And you could watch that after 9/11. Obviously, 9/11 was a terrible attack. Like I said, I was in Manhattan that day. I remember it very well. It was a terrible event. It was a trauma, etc. But what immediately happened is that people who long had other agendas, including invading Iraq and wanting to remove Saddam Hussein for whatever reasons, who were advocating that in the 90s, wanting to go and do the same in Iran, wanting to expand spying power, immediately saw in this 9/11 attack an opportunity while the country was still kind of recuperating from the shock of it. And that's when you got this like flurry of legislation as if it had already been pre-prepared. And it eventually did lead to the invasion of Iraq by convincing 70% of Americans that Saddam Hussein was the one who had personally planned the 9/11 attack and was involved in the 9/11 attack, as well as, of course, the belief that he had weapons of mass destruction. So you can see this formula repeating itself over and over. And that's one of the things that I realized early on was when I started writing about politics, if you look at my writings for the first 6 months or year, it was very focused on legalistic arguments. I just kind of thought, like, as long as I can show people that this is adverse to the Constitution, that what's being done is exactly what the founders wanted to prohibit, that it was dangerous to them, that people would see the light. And I quickly realized that that was very naive, in part because you have a media wall you have to get through, right? These major media corporations that are disseminating this information on behalf of the government. I mean, people didn't just come to believe Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. They believed it because the media outlets they trusted, like the New York Times and the Atlantic and the New Yorker.
Well, it was also Colin Powell. It was also Colin Powell at the UN making that presentation. It was a trusted figure, and it was like, wow, would they go this public and this specific if they didn't know there was actually? I remember at the time I was in university and I was looking at it. I didn't really, I was just looking for the truth, right? Like, wow, I mean, it does look. It looked to these eyes as evidence, and then when we discovered it was there were none, and when. For me, personally, like when a lot of my political cynicism came to bear was really around this WMD issue, and just looking at Bush administration admitting that there were no WMDs, but then still staying in Iraq. I was like, that's when I was like,
not
all
really
right.
admitting that it was the wrong thing to do either. I know. I think a lot of. I mean, that was exactly my trajectory. As I said before, I started writing about politics when I was practicing, I wasn't really that focused on politics. But I was paying attention with one eye. I read the New York Times every morning, and I had a subscription to the New Yorker and the Atlantic, all things that good high-end consumers were consuming. To believe the kind of, I trusted that, I wasn't so naive to think there was no falsehoods in there, but I thought it was at least giving me the generalized sense of what was happening in the world. I kind of trusted it to inform me and shape my perspectives. And I think the realization that it wasn't just the government. I think a lot of people know the government might lie, but then especially a Republican government, a lot of Democrats look to liberal media outlets like the New York Times and these other liberal journals that they trusted. And a lot of Democrats like, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and John Kerry were telling them as well. I think there was this sense, I know I had it, that it seems unlikely that all of these institutions would unite to just all convince us of something that is completely false as a pretense for going to war. And of course, that's exactly what happened. And I think it did really erode the trust that a lot of people had built up in these institutions. I don't think these institutions ever really recovered from that. But I think one of the things, at least I learned, is that the way in which that was done was through fear. Remember, Condoleezza Rice would say things like, oh, people want a smoking gun. The problem is we can't have the smoking gun be a mushroom cloud, over New York City, meaning that Saddam Hussein was going to pass to Al-Qaeda a nuclear bomb and that was going to be detonated. I mean, that is playing right to our most visceral fears of protecting ourselves, our children, our family. And when you could put people in fear, they're no longer operating rationally and they can be convinced of anything. And so I quickly realized that in order to do the work I wanted to do, I not only had to address media propaganda and kind of do media critiques and show where media accounts that people believed were untrue or unreliable, but also confront this idea that a lot of these risks were being wildly exaggerated.
Yeah, very much. Very interesting. And I wonder, then you see during COVID, again, taking a non-political lens at this issue, the way I sort of look at it is it's not like there is no self-interest when power is exercised, right? When power is sort of centralized in the hands of government or when it's kind of centralized in the hands of big corporations, it's not like there's no incentives there. It's not like there's no self-interest there. And so every time there's an issue like this, I think the way you say it is exactly right. A lot of people will contest this on the grounds that it sounds like conspiracy theory. It's more like opportunism from people that have the ability to sort of centralize power when kind of society-wide fear grips us, and then they take the opportunity to kind of centralize the power, and then it becomes a power agenda, and then there's very little we can do until that fear passes. Is that kind of the way you see it as well?
Yeah, I think sometimes people resist this idea because it seems as though you're insinuating a kind of villain-like evil that most people think might be exaggerated. So it's not like necessarily, I mean, this does happen, but it doesn't require this notion that you have these villains in like a James Bond-like underground lair, rubbing their hands together about all the power they're going to get by scaring everybody. It can be much more banal than that. I mean, that's, Hannah Arendt, the Jewish German philosopher, when she attended the Nuremberg trials, was expecting to see these, raving, evil, satanic people who had just implemented the Holocaust. And she found instead a lot of people who were like accountants, just very bureaucratic, very organizational, kind of just following institutional inertia.
The banality of evil.
The banality of evil, exactly. Yeah. And I think that is oftentimes the way it works is if you're working in Washington, you want more importance and more power and authority for your agency. You want more budgetary authority. You want more status. And the way that you get that is by getting more powers and convincing people that your mission, whatever it is more important than other people might realize, which requires hype and fear. I think another terrible incentive is that the way our national security system and culture works in Washington is people who say, I'm against a war, don't get into the important rooms where decisions are made. If you were saying, I'm against the Iraq war, you were just thrown out of the room. Just like now, if you say you're against the U.S.-NATO war in Ukraine, for example, you don't get into the rooms. But if you say, I support the war and I want to debate how it best should be done, that's the only way you get access. And so there's this great career and career incentive to support a lot of these things as well, because that's the way that you gain entrance into the halls of power that can make you famous, make you wealthy, make you powerful. And all of us as human beings are susceptible to these temptations. And when you have a system as powerful as the one in Washington that encourages this and fuels this with the world's, only superpower, the most militarized and powerful and wealthiest country in human history, a lot of people are going to do whatever they have to be a part of that and to gain from that. And I think that encourages a lot of these behavioral incentives.
Yeah, that's a good point. Free speech is also a huge battleground for a lot of these issues, and speech is usually censored for what sounds like a good reason, right? So safety is one example. Another one could be loyalty to the group, or protecting vulnerable people, or preventing the spread of hate, right? It never gets restricted in the name of a bad idea. The idea always sounds good. There's always this idea of protecting someone or protecting something. And so because of that, the case for speech needs to be made over and over and over. And I recently just reread some of the big case law on free speech, and there's many good reasons for free speech. You have the wide and messy search for truth. You have, slippery slope arguments where, you can start by restricting bad speech, and then you end up restricting more and more. The importance of making evil visible. You get all these arguments. I'm curious, from your perspective, as someone who's actually fought this fight so strongly, often paid a price for it, what's your kind of core summation for why free speech is so critical, and why we need to constantly push back against these very logical sounding attempts to diminish it?
I just don't trust any human being or any institution composed of human beings to arrive at a belief that we're supposed to deem so self-evidently true that no one is permitted any longer to question it or disagree with it or dissent from it. I just don't. I honestly, there are a lot of political values that I hold, a lot of causes I'm dedicated to, a lot of things I fervently believe in, but it would never occur to me to reach a state of hubris necessary for me to believe about myself that I have removed myself from the history of intellectual progress, which is human beings thinking they've acquired absolute truth only for the next generation to conclude that that is wildly erroneous, if not shameful. I think it takes a hubris to believe about yourself that you have acquired a kind of knowledge that is so absolute and so unchallengeable that the force of law or the force of corporate power should be deployed to prevent people from questioning or disagreeing with the things that you've said. That's one thing. This is a matter of truth. I don't trust this notion that some things are so sacrosanct as beliefs that they can never be challenged. And then the second part of it is, which I guess is, I wouldn't say more important, it's just kind of a different consideration, which is if you attain the power to dictate which views can be expressed and which ones can't, what kind of punishments get doled out for questioning certain views, the power that you acquire is almost unlimited by definition. If you have a very powerful political party or a political movement that's in control, as long as others have the right to critique it and to try and convince others that that political group or that political movement is misguided or should be opposed, there's always an opportunity to undermine that group and to remove them from power and change the course of your society. If, though, you lose that one right to be able to say, this group is engaging in bad behavior and not good behavior, their ideas are wrong and not right, if you lose that right, then the group that has taken that away from you exercises totalitarian power. It just means that you can't question anything they're doing or saying, which in turn means you can't resist in any way their attempt to control how people think and how people think about them in particular and their ideas. And I don't think there's anything more dangerous than that. So I'm, of course, aware that it's possible that free speech would produce sometimes bad consequences. You can spread hate speech, you can spread bad ideas, you can incite violence with hate speech. There are costs to it, but there are costs to every freedom. For example, we decide as a society, pretty much every country in the West does, that we don't allow the police to just break into any home that it wants whenever they decide that there's a reason to do so because they're trying to catch a criminal or solve a crime. They have to go to a court and convince a court that there's reason to enter a home. That barrier that we put in front of the police almost certainly sometimes means that murderers or rapists or dangerous criminals end up getting away. There's a cost to that freedom, but we say those costs are outweighed by the importance of the right not to have the police enter your home upon the decision that they should. And to me, that's what free speech is. You can't deny that some speech sometimes creates harm, but the benefit of being able to have free speech and the danger of not having it is so much greater.